Evil, however powerful it is right now, is only vestigial. And if we all just set our minds to it, our own efforts will realize these ancient promises of peace and security. The late British Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zatzal, whom I deeply admired, probably sensing that such a position sounds like the sort of progressivist optimism that had trouble surviving World War I, not to mention the Shoah, sought to distinguish Jewish hope from optimism. Optimism and hope are not the same, he wrote. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better. Hope is the belief that together we can make the world better, end quote. The Hebrew Bible, Rabbi Sacks went on to say, is not an optimistic book. It is, however, one of the great literatures of hope, end quote. I confess I find Rabbi Sacks's biblical hope to be itself quite optimistic. In order to work together to make the world better, we must first agree on what that better world ought to look like. I've never heard anyone say they were trying to make the world worse. But is it altogether in our power to produce such consensus? As for the Hebrew Bible, many texts therein do obviously correlate good behavior with good fortune and bad behavior with bad fortune, thus providing some basis for his claim that our fate is altogether in our own hands. But I hope to show this morning that such texts are not properly characterized as propounding a rigid retributive ethic. In the Torah, the correlation in question is most pronounced in the blessings and curses of covenant. A blessing, brachot, in the wake of covenantal fidelity manifested in observance of the covenantal suzerain stipulations, but curses, klalot, in the wake of infidelity and disobedience. The same basic idea is in plentiful evidence in the prophets, as in these words from the opening chapter of Isaiah. If you are willing and give heed, you shall eat the good of the land, but if you refuse and rebel, you shall be consumed by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Isaiah 1, 19 through 20. In the Tuvim, finally, this correlation is most easily found in the book of Proverbs, as in these two couplets. The Lord does not allow the righteous to go hungry, but he pushes away the desire of the wicked. A slack hand produces poverty, but the hand of the diligent brings riches. Notice that the first couplet in this last passage ascribes the correlation to the action of God, whereas the latter, lacking any reference to a divine will or supernatural intervention, simply presents it as the way the world works. The righteous and industrious succeed, the wicked and lazy fail. This is the deed-consequence nexus, so characteristic of Proverbs. I actually prefer to say it in German, der Tun gehen Zusammenhang. Everything sounds a little better in biblical studies in German. Tun gehen Zusammenhang, the way the deed and the consequence hang together. The deed-consequence nexus, so characteristic of Proverbs and other compositions conventionally classified as wisdom literature. One familiar affirmation of the deed-consequence nexus has sometimes occasioned controversy in traditional Jewish circles, including especially the conservative movement, as I understand it. I've been young and have grown old. I've been young and have grown old now, but I've never seen a righteous person abandoned or his children begging for bread. Psalm 37:25. About this verse, traditionally sung at the end of the blessing after meals, Birkat HaMazon, the comment of the eminent British Old Testament scholar John Barton sums up the views of many. The author Barton writes was, quote, surely someone who should have got out more, end quote. In what is still the standard scholarly thinking, the trauma of various catastrophes, most obviously the devastating victory of the Neo-Babylon Empire in 586 BCE, profoundly undermined belief in the deed-consequence nexus and all its various idioms, covenantal, prophetic, sapiential, or whatever. And so daring books like Job and Kohelet raised the frightening prospect that there may ultimately be no hopeful counterpoint to the catastrophes that nations and individuals suffer. The insular and unrealistic traditionalists had, as it were, finally been forced to get out. And when they did, they could not deal with what they saw. In my view, this interpretation, though very widespread, is at best simplistic. Let's start with the correlation of blessings with faithfulness and obedience, and of curses with betrayal and defiance, so typical of biblical covenantal texts, especially prominent in the book most suffused with covenantal thinking, Deuteronomy, Dvarim. The correlation is indeed prevalent in such literature, but is it really absolute? In a nicely argued counterstatement, Joel S. Kaminsky, granting the importance of such thinking, still raised the key question, quote, the key objection, quote, it is less clear that Deuteronomy ever asserts that this means that if someone is suffering, they must have committed a sin, end quote, he points out, or, quote, that the righteous would never experience any adversity. Yet many interpreters presume that this is indeed what Deuteronomy and texts like Proverbs and Psalms affirm, end quote. In fact, Kaminsky points out Deuteronomy explicitly presents an alternative to the idea that adversity results only from sin. Remember the road by which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness now for 40 years in order to humble you, anotacha, and to test you, to find out what is in your hearts. Would you keep his commandments or not? Deuteronomy 8:12. Here, suffering is not punitive. It is probative. It's a test. As a later verse in the same chapter summarizes the matter, God humbled and tested Israel in the wilderness, only to benefit them in the end, and to teach them the folly of thinking, my own power and the strength of my own hand have gotten me this wealth. More than that, as Kaminsky further notes, quote, Deuteronomy underlines the importance of being generous to the poor and marginalized in Israelite society. Now, if one's current situation were simply a reflection of what one deserved, then these injunctions to help the poor and marginalized would make no sense. After all, ameliorating a needy person's situation would interfere with God's punishment of them. And that's a quote from Kaminsky. Are we, in other words, to believe that their own sins have brought the persona miserables, the so stressed throughout biblical literature, the poor, the landless alien, ger, the orphan, the widow, into their wretched condition? Quite to the contrary, Deuteronomy, to cite that supremely covenantal book once more, prefaces its command to love the landless alien with the statement that God does so himself. God himself is Ohev Gerim. And Proverbs, often accused of adhering to a mechanistic, deed-consequent schema, equates generosity to the poor with honoring God. And one of my favorite Proverbs, those who oppress the poor revile their maker, but those who are kind to the needy honor him. Proverbs 14:31. In both these cases, and I'm sure most of us could think of a multitude of others, there is no hint that the needy or vulnerable have brought calamity upon themselves. And this is another way of phrasing the same point, that worldly good fortune is the natural state of humanity, and only transgression can interrupt it. Note as well that those proverbs that teach that it's better to acquire wisdom and discernment than gold and silver, implying that not all the wise and discerning grow rich. And finally, consider the implications of Proverbs 17:1. Better a dry morsel of bread with tranquility than a house full of feasting with strife. Here, the assumption is that some poor people are living out the wisdom ethic, and some rich people are not. The same non-correlation of good fortune with good behavior and of affliction with sin can be found in narrative books as well. What sin of Israel's brought about the enslavement and attempted annihilation of them in Egypt? So far as I know, the Bible never suggests there was any. Rabbinic tradition strikes me as, on balance, rather more moralistic and judgmental, eager to vindicate God by finding flaws in the biblical figures who seem to suffer justly. All right, seem to suffer. All right, I'll now skip ahead to leave the rabbinic examples out. I do not mean to imply that post-biblical Judaism lacks awareness of the suffering of the innocent. That would be absurd. My point, rather, is that the straining of Midrash and classical medieval commentators, the Meforshim, to find the sin that accounts for the adversity that brought about the Agadah, the adversity that brought about the Shibud Mitzrayim, to find the sin that accounts for the adversity highlights nicely the absence of such thinking in the particular biblical text on which they are commenting. Biblical narrative is hardly lacking in examples of traumatic events not occasioned by sin. How then shall we put together the well-nigh ubiquitous biblical affirmations of the nexus of deen and consequence, on the one hand, with those subtler acknowledgments that the nexus is not always there? Part of the answer lies in the issue of timing. Recall again Psalm 37, the Nahayiti line, with its speaker's seemingly outrageous claim that I have never seen a righteous person abandoned or his children begging for bread. Yet the same acrostic poem readily affirms that the righteous may have little and the wicked much, even becoming, quote, powerful like a robust native tree, verse 35. As I've written elsewhere, this makes it highly unlikely that the offending verse is to be taken as describing empirical reality. Rather, a major point of the whole poem is to assert that the idealized situation affirmed in such verses is the only one that can last. What is called for is faith in God's justice and patience until it arrives. Hence, just after the simile of the well-rooted tree, we read this about the wicked man to whom it applies. Suddenly, he was vanished and was gone. I sought him, but he was not to be found. Verse 36. I take the theological affirmation here to be that the ideal world, the world for which we hope, does not indeed appear in empirical reality, but is not, or at least is not a constant there. It may appear there, it's not constantly present. The alternative world, the familiar world, all too familiar world of suffering and trauma and loss, is in the last analysis less well-founded and less secure. That's the claim. It is in fact temporary. But while it lasts, the life can be excruciatingly painful, and the arrival of the expected reality remains devoutly to be wished for. And there is good reason to wonder whether it will ever come. Think of laments like Psalm 70, in which the speaker hears no oracle of comfort, complains, lament, hears no oracle of comfort, and concludes with the haunting words, Hashem al ta'achar, Lord, don't delay. Did God ever come to that psalmist's rescue? Much other literature in the Tanakh reflects this belief that there is a time lag between the current reality and the arrival of the just world, so often affirmed and acclaimed in the same corpus. Psalm 92, for example, for the Yom HaShabbat, views the failure to recognize that justice is coming as characteristic of the brutish person, Ishbar, and the fool, Kasil. In its canonical shape, the notoriously disjointed book of Job exhibits the same pattern. Divine justice is suspended in the first two chapters of Job, the prose prologue, disputed in most of the long middle section, and reinstated in the final chapter, when the righteous sufferer is at long last vindicated and restored. In that sense, the book in its current arrangement confirms the claim of Job's friend Bildad early on, that if the sufferer is truly righteous and humbly supplicates God, God will return him to his rightful condition, Job 8:5-6. Most of the prophetic books, it's interesting, you look at rabbinic literature, medieval Jewish and Christian commentary, you find they often think that the comforters of Job are the ones who are in the right. As I recall, even Rambam says, Job may be tzaddik, may be a righteous person. God never calls him chacham. He never actually approves of his theology. And not to mention, Talmudic texts refer to him as a kofer beikar because of his seeming denial of tchiyat hametim, of resurrection of the dead. Most of the prophetic books, too, have been shaped so as to affirm God's future rectification of things after periods of suffering. Not all of it necessarily deserved. In the later Second Temple and rabbinic periods, the time lag can be much longer, as in the 70 weeks of years of Daniel 24. In the words of the penultimate verse of that book, Daniel, Ashrei ha'mechakeh, blessed is he who waits, Daniel 12:12. In rabbinic literature, what is ultimately awaited for is the new age marked by the advent of the Messiah and all that comes with it, although I have seen a few posters around Yerushalayim, even just staying on my blog, that indicate that Mashiach, the Hamelach Mashiach is already around. So I wrote this last fall. I wrote this last fall. What did I know? In the word, what's ultimately waited for is the advent of the Messiah and all that comes with it, the definitive judgment upon wrongdoers and the vindication of the innocent, the restoration of the people of Israel to the promised land, the reconstruction of the temple, and the return to it of the presence of God, and of course, the resurrection of the dead. Within the structure of the ongoing Jewish tradition, as it has come down to us, one cannot adequately address the relationship of trauma to hope without taking into account those rabbinic ideas of the messianic reign, Yemot HaMashiach, and the coming age, Atid Lavo, the resurrection of the dead, Tchiyat HaMeitim, and the world to come, Olam Haba. It is true that the nomenclature of each of these is foreign to the Tanakh and biblical literature is too diverse in character and mythopoetic in expression to lend itself to easy systematization. But what these terms express has substantial precedent in biblical thinking and the relationship of humanity with the faithful God who promises life and justice in a world currently full of death and iniquity. So much for timing as a key to understanding how biblical texts can affirm both the deed-consequence nexus and the reality of innocent suffering, thus upholding both the justice of God and the sad facts of the current world order. There is, however, another factor that we must take into account, namely the way biblical rhetoric works, and in turn the underlying thought patterns that it manifests. Consider the following familiar sentence: smoking causes cancer. In one possible understanding, the sentence is clearly false. Many people smoke and never get cancer. Many people who don't smoke do, sadly, get cancer. So a more accurate statement would be, smoking increases your chances of getting cancer by X%. But would such a sentence, posted, let's say, on a pack of cigarettes, be as effective as the unnuanced claim that smoking causes cancer? Suppose, just to make up some numbers hypothetically, the warning said that one's chances of getting cancer go up by a factor of 10 if one smokes, from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100, or from 1 in 100 to 1 in 10. In that case, can you not imagine many smokers happily accepting the news that their chance of not being stricken with cancer was only 99% or 90%, respectively? What we see in this example is a tension between the felt need to persuade people not to smoke and the dispassionate statement of statistical facts. It seems to me, however, that in ancient Israel, what we call statistical probabilities were unknown, or if they were known, the rhetorical needs of the literature overwhelmed them, just as the rhetorical needs of that cigarette pack overwhelm the actual statistical facts. I can illustrate this with a proverb we examined earlier. A slack hand produces poverty, but the hand of the diligent brings riches, Proverbs 10:4. Should we read this as saying that the lazy always end up poor and the industrious rich? Did those who authored, transmitted, or reverently received this couplet never encounter a person who was indolent and wealthy, or someone who was hardworking but impoverished? My suspicion is that they did. Pace, Professor Barton, they did not need to get out more. And that what they meant in our own idiom is that hard work makes one likelier to succeed. But our idiom is informed by quantitative thinking and calculations of probability that were quite alien to the culture of ancient Israel. And a proverb or other didactic form of literature would be much less likely to persuade its hearers and readers to adjust their behavior. As Joel Kaminsky notes, it's a quote, even the most secular parents tend to tell their children that good behavior eventually will be rewarded and bad behavior brings negative consequences, although such recompense may take time to become manifest. For the record, it is likely that much of biblical language in texts like Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Proverbs that is seen as promoting rigid and mechanistic views of retribution served a similar hortatory and pedagogical function. I would add rhetorical function. And in truth, the audience that biblical preaching is in its various modes presupposes seems very much like a group of wayward children. Deuteronomy, to return to that example, leaves the impression that it is addressed to a community of faithless, forgetful ingrates, habitually inclined to violate covenant. As Moshe puts it to them, you have been rebellious against the Lord as long as I have known you. Or if you follow the Samaritan and Septuagint versions, as long as he has known you, as long as he's known you, you've been rebellious against Hashem. Not a great recommendation. And our other example, Proverbs, gives the impression of addressing a society in which sages are few and far between, whereas shallow, distractible, and easily seduced young men are plentiful. Consider the conclusion to Lady Wisdom's great speech in chapter 8. Chokhmah, personified or apostatized as a woman, the opposite of the Isha Zara, the strange woman, or the Eshet Hololut, the woman of foolishness. She says, And now, my sons, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways, hear instruction, and grow wise. Do not spurn it. For he who finds me and obtains finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who misses me or sins against me, chotai, does violence to himself. All those who hate me love death. You get the feeling a lot of people in the world of Proverbs presupposes that in the mind of the authors of Proverbs, love death. Pretty strong language, but I doubt the author thought anything less could work. Much other biblical literature, in fact, is cast as the product of an embattled and endangered minority. Consider the words of the prophet Elijah. They have put your prophets to the sword. I alone remain, and they seek to take my life. 1 Kings 19:10-14. In a situation like that, a finely nuanced description of the consequences of misbehavior and their timing would be pointless. To us, such language seems inexact and histrionic. You need to get out more. To the authors who held such a view of the social situation, it was right on target. We have seen then that trauma and hope are both prominent in the Bible, and neither can be taken as the last word, the final description of reality. In most of this literature, human behavior makes a huge difference, but contrary to our quote what our quote from Rabbi Sachs claims, it is not always dispositive. Human behavior is not always dispositive. It doesn't all depend on what we do. For undeserved suffering is a reality, even in genres that at first glance seem to hold a mechanistic model which everyone gets what they deserve, neither more nor less. The other side of the coin, however, also bears mention. Undeserved benefit or grace is also a reality, and it too undermines the mechanistic model and the concomitant reduction of God's will to justice alone. Generosity too defies merit, and grace can be hard to distinguish from arbitrariness. To give one familiar example, why does God single out Abraham and make the astounding promise that he will be a great nation, a byword or source of universal blessing, and the possessor through his descendants of the land of Canaan? In the spirit of Job, Abraham too might have asked, what have I done to deserve this? The literature of the late Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism developed several overlapping answers to this apparent violation of distributive justice. Abraham saw through the material idolatry and determinism of his culture, rediscovering God and witnessing to him, even at the threat to his very life. He practiced the justice and righteousness God expects, even observing the Mosaic Torah before it was revealed. Or he manifested a deep and abiding faith in God, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that the promises would never come to be. But earlier still in Genesis 22, the second angelic address at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, it reinterprets those promises as consequences of Abraham's refusal to withhold his beloved son when God commanded the excruciatingly painful act of sacrifice. In other words, the Akedah is now, the promises to Abraham that you first hear in Perek Yod Bet and Lech Lecha are now reformulated as dependent on Abraham's great act in the Akedah. Each of these cases actually highlights the absence of such thinking in earlier literature. The fact that is that God's singling out of Abraham in Genesis 12 comes as a bolt out of the blue, as it were. It is not presented as the reward for some antecedent act on the beneficiary's part. Even the very opportunity to act righteously or heroically is presented as a gift from God, not an earned benefit. Deuteronomy highlights memorably the element of apparent unworthiness in God's choosing of Israel. He did so as an act of something akin to erotic passion, chashak Hashem bechem, because he loved Israel, mehavat Hashem etchem, and had for no cited reason, sworn a covenantal oath to their ancestors. He took them out of Egypt. That's why he took them out of Egypt. It wasn't an opposition to slavery or such thing. Just as the biblical text cites no sin of the people of Israel to account for their enslavement and subjection to attempted genocide, so no biblical text cites a merit to explain that triumphant liberation. Here too, of course, rabbinic midrash will later and understandably seek to fill the gap in a creative and edifying way. It's worried about that closeness of grace, of chesed, to arbitrariness. But the gap is real, and the biblical scholar must reckon with it. For all the language of blessings and curses key to Israel's behavior that we find in texts redolent of covenant, and even there we find an unmistakable element of grace, chesed, a note of hope even after well-deserved catastrophe. The long lists of blessings and curses of Leviticus 26, Hogotai, thus concludes with the affirmation that when Israel is held captive in the lands of their enemies because they rejected God's norms, and as a result, the promised land itself has been rendered desolate, even then, a positive future beckons. They can still confess their sins and humble themselves, and when they do, God will remember his irrevocable covenant with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, and remember the land as well. Leviticus 26, 40 through 45. Clearly, covenant does not reduce to mere conditionality. It is a contract of sorts, but much more than what we think of as a contract today. As presented here and in kindred texts, the conditions exist within a larger framework. The conditions exist within a larger framework of unconditionality, one that reflects the unshakable faithfulness and reliability of the covenantal suzerain, and at least in some texts, his inexplicable love as well. On the basis of their previous behavior, Israel does not deserve a second chance, but they get one. I've been arguing that there is a deep continuity between God's inflicting suffering on the innocent, or at least tolerating it, and his generosity in awarding benefactions to the undeserving. Bad luck and good luck are both luck. Why it should be this way, I cannot say. I won't even attempt the Miltonic texts of justifying the ways of God to human beings. What I will say, though, is that the problem, if it is a problem, derives from the fact, in some degree, from the fact that in most ancient Jewish literature, including the Bible, God is personal and thus not always predictable. There is no algorithm that accounts for how he has acted or will act in every case, though, as we've seen, much biblical literature in a hymnic mode asserts that there is. In that high rhetorical mode, it does assert that there's 100% reliable and instantaneously. It is this personal, relational, and irreducibly particular nature of the God of Israel, as such texts conceive him, that accounts for the fact that he comes to be known mostly through story. Unlike philosophical speculation about the Godhead, these biblical stories purport to show God acting in history and manifesting a range of emotions and responses, not mutely and passively undergirding ultimate reality. It is also the factor that explains why human beings can argue respectfully with him, as figures like Abraham, Moses, Amos, and Jeremiah are presented as doing, rather than submissively accepting his will as the final truth and the way things have to be. Those of a philosophical bent will understandably ask why reality should be this way, the product and domain of a personal and therefore sometimes unpredictable deity. In the Tanakh, however, what is asked for is not an explanation, but an action, that God intervened to end the suffering and resume his good relations with the victims of divine wrath or bad luck. This somewhat recalls Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's little book, Koldo Dito Fake, in which he, which I think in English is called Fate and Destiny, in which he advocates, quote, an approach that is an ethico-halachic one, devoid of the slightest speculative metaphysical coloration. We do not, he writes, inquire into the hidden ways of the Almighty, but rather about the way wherein man shall walk when suffering strikes. I would note, end of quote, I would note, however, that biblical literature, like the traditional liturgy, offers a third stance, one of direct address to the deity, even a respectful faulting of the deity in an effort to convince him to relent. Shuva Hashem ad batai hinachem alavedecha. Turn back, O Lord, how long? Have compassion on your servants. Psalm 90, verse 13. So far, we've been considering the relationship of trauma to hope within a temporal framework. The traumatized community or individual hopes for healing, for a reversal of the catastrophe that has befallen them, for restoration, and even if the disaster is unmerited, for vindication against their accusers and tormentors. In this model, trauma and hope are sequential. But were we to stop here, we would miss another key dimension of the relationship in the scriptures, one in which the better world, the ideal state of being, the healed reality, is available now, though not yet as a continuing and unchallenged reality. In the Tanakh, this notion of an ideal world appears with particular force in traditions about the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. I think, for example, perhaps the most familiar of Psalms, the 23rd, in which the speaker tells of the Lord's providing an abundant feast for him in the full view of his enemies, Neged Sorarai, who are unable to touch him. No wonder the speaker wishes to dwell in the temple L'orech Yamim for a very long time, Psalm 23, verse 5 and 6. As in some biblical law, the sanctuary provides asylum, a place where the innocent cannot be seized. This preternatural protection is a consequence of something prior and more important, the presence of God in his temple. The presence, that is, of the divine king enthroned in his palace. Thus, another psalmist identifies this singular desire as the ability to, quote, gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, if that's the correct translation, to visit his temple. More than that, to spend his entire life there. The gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, whatever noam there is, ulevaker behechalo, and Psalm 27:4. And even if we identify the speaking voice of such psalms as an individual, traditionally King David, the fact remains that the Zion traditions in the Tanakh speak movingly of God's special protection of his sacred mountain itself and of the community centered on it. To the author of Psalm 48, for example, the temple atop Mount Zion is the place where God's care and protection are especially imaginable, can be imagined. Diminu Elohim chastecha bekerev heichalecha, Psalm 48:9. They're even in some sense visible. A tour of Zion's very towers, ramparts, and citadels will testify, the psalmist avers, that the great king, whose temple this is our God forever and ever, verses 3-14. The world evoked in the Zion literature is one of innocence, inviolability, fertility, the availability of God, and even intimacy with him. If this sounds familiar, it is in part because of the overlap of conceptions of temple and paradise in the ancient Near East, more generally, which Israelite literature continued, adapted, and enriched. I leave out a quote from my late colleague, Lawrence Steger. No wonder that when the second temple was about to be built, or still new, biblical prophets envisioned nothing less than the imminent restoration of Edenic conditions of Gan Eden. To give just one of many examples, it is predicted that a stream would issue from the temple, flow east to heal the saline waters of the Dead Sea, making fish abundant there, so that everything will live wherever it goes. So Ezekiel 47:9. One might think that with the loss of the temple, the spiritual experience of which the biblical Zion tradition spoke has altogether disappeared, as well, and with it the possibility, however fleeting, of participation in that higher world. And the higher world and paradise has been utterly lost. Against this, however, one could point to the import of the canonization of the texts and their incorporation into liturgy, with proper intention, kavanah, and proper attention, iyun. The recitation of such psalms becomes a spiritual exercise in and of itself, rendering the experience of the hoped-for world available now. Important qualification: don't expect this to happen when the texts are mumbled rapidly and without comprehension. We should also note that the temple spirituality survived in later Jewish literature that tells of tours of the heavenly realm, or visions of the end time, when the temple will be restored and the new heavens and new earth created, Isaiah 65:17. The higher world, to use spatial language, and the future world, to use temporal language, are not encased in their own inaccessible zones. To adapt Martin Buber, if will and grace are joined, faithful Jews can have a taste of them even within the tragic and painful reality in which they otherwise may live. Here I am reminded of the historian of religion, the late Jonathan Z. Smith's observation that, quote, ritual represents the creation of a controlled environment in such a way that this ritualized perfection is recollected in the ordinary, uncontrolled course of things, end of quote. I would only add that ritual sometimes yields something more than just recollection. It yields the perception and participation of a higher reality, opening up worlds, as it were, transforming the self in the process. To me, Smith's mention of the creation of a controlled environment, of ritualized perfection, and the ordinary uncontrolled, within the ordinary uncontrolled course of things, brings nothing to mind more than Shabbat, a whole day created in a sense to contrast with the workaday course of the other 6 days of the week, the ordinary days, the Yemei Chol. In the narrative in which we first meet the noun Shabbat in the Tanakh, I'm speaking of priority of narrative order, not order of composition. The story of the manna in Exodus 16, Israel's great test is to trust in God's promise that the extra manna gathered on the sixth day, unlike that gathered on the first five, will not spoil, but will instead provide sustenance without further human effort. The narrative in Exodus 16 thus brilliantly links the gift of the manna to the gift of the Shabbat, and at a deeper theological level dramatizes the common element of the two phenomena, radical trust in God's provision. Early rabbinic midrash makes the implication for this spiritual practice explicit. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Kol melachtecha. Is it possible for a human being to do all his work in 6 days? Rather, rest as if all your work has been done. Shavot ke'ilu kol melachtecha asuya. Another interpretation, rest from the very thought of labor. Shavot mimachashevet avodah. That's Mechot Rabbi Yishmael Chodesh 7. At the end of each week, Sabbath observers are thus to enter an as-if world, a ke'ilu world, that contrasts with the ordinary one, but is no less real. In this Shabbat, it seems to me, has much in common with what the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga calls play. Peter Berger, who applied Huizinga's thinking to modern recovery of the supernatural, puts it this way, quote, one aspect of play that Huizinga analyzes in some detail is that play sets up a separate universe of discourse with its own rules, which suspends for the duration the rules and general assumptions of the serious world. End of quote. Quote, joy is play's intention, Berger writes. Quote, this intention is, however, particularly patent in the joy experienced in play. Precisely the playful universe has a temporal dimension that is more than momentary and that can be perceived as a distinct structure. In other words, in joyful play, it appears as if one were stepping not only from one chronology into another, but from time into eternity, end of quote. Neither structure nor chronology exhausts the totality of reality, of course. The faithful Jew is to live in both worlds without absolutizing either of them, for now that is. But in rabbinic tradition, as is well known, the ritualized world of Shabbat comes to be interpreted as a foretaste of the world to come, an earnest of the coming redemption from the exigencies, anxieties, and tragedies of the current order of things. In short, a restoration of Eden, Gan Eden. Thus, can the Mishnah describe Psalm 92, labeled in the Tanakh as a song for the Sabbath day, as actually a song for the future world, for the day that will be entirely a Sabbath, rest for everlasting life. Once again, trauma and hope are not sequential, or not fully sequential. The practice of the Sabbath brings the future world into the present, opening within the current order of things a window into the promised perfection, the new heavens and the new earth promised, but yet to be created. In recent decades, anthropologists and comparative religionists have given more systematic attention to the as-if world of ritual and its ontological status. The outstanding example is Ritual and Its Consequences, an essay on the limits of sincerity by 4 authors working jointly. Adam B. Seligman, I think originally Israeli, Adam B. Seligman, Robert P. Weller, Michael J. Pewitt, and Bennett Simon, termed the world that, quote, ritual creates, quote, as subjunctive, an as-if or could-be universe, as distinguished from an as-is vision of what often becomes a totalistic, unambiguous vision of reality as it really is, with the really in italics for good reason, end of quote. In other words, there's something in the performance of ritual that is akin to illusion, to play acting, to make-believe, but to the participants at least, no dissimulation is involved. There is no concealment, but rather an entering into an alternative universe. Illusions, these authors thus write, quote, are a form of the subjunctive. Illusion is what can be, as indeed so many symbolic worlds can. Okay, quickly. Now, like verbs in the subjunctive mood, this ritualistic subjunctive expresses a wish, a hope, a possibility, in contradistinction to those in the indicative, which express a plain empirical fact. That the liturgical and mythic texts that serve as librettos to rituals, or at least as literary counterparts to the ritual performances, can be cast in indicative mode should not be taken to mean that they peddle false descriptions of immediately experienced reality. Think again of the psalmist's empirically unlikely claim that he's never seen a righteous person abandoned or his progeny seeking food. Perhaps it's not the psalmist, but those who fault him who need to get out more. For in the words of this book, Seligman, etc., participants practicing ritual act as if the world produced in ritual were in fact a real one, and they do so fully conscious that such a subjunctive world exists in endless tension with an alternative world of daily experience. The person who observes the Shabbat is sort of aware that Sunday is coming. It is not the case, that is, that those who participate in ritual action need be under any illusion that what they do or say in the ritual context describes quotidian reality, ordinary empirical reality. Quite the contrary, as the four authors put it, quote, the meaning produced through the ritual action always exists in problematic tension with the non-ritual world, end of quote. This reconception of ritual and its relationship to the more easily observed world of mundane experience helps us understand how Judaism and its practices, especially Shabbat, can provide hope and relief even in the current absence of the promised end time and the anticipated reversals of the current, often traumatic order of things. But about one point that Seligman and his co-authors make, I, speaking as a specialist in Judaism, or trying to be, should like to raise a question. Quote, instead of reading ritual in terms of a worldview of harmony, then, they write, we will emphasize ritual in terms of the tragic. From the point of view of ritual, the world is fragmented and fractured. That is why the endless world of ritual is necessary, even if that work is always ultimately doomed, end of quote. Although we should be leery of grand generalizations about ritual at large, which I think they may be guilty, in the Jewish cases that we have examined here, the ritual alone does not resolve the tension between the indicative and the subjunctive. The person finding both the presence of God and personal refuge in the temple will have to leave the sacred precincts eventually, just as the holiness of Shabbat gives way to the rough world of the workaday week. But words like tragic, endless, and doomed miss something important in the structure of classical Judaism. They miss the way these short-lived moments of transcendence anticipate the end time, when God, permanently enthroned in his temple, will honor his promises to heal the fragmented and fractured world and usher in the day that will be entirely a Sabbath, rest for everlasting life. For those with faith in that vision, the end of the story is not tragedy and doom at all. It's the triumph of laughter over tears, hope over trauma, or in the words of the familiar psalm, those who sow in tears shall reap with songs of joy. Though he walks along crying, carrying a bag of seeds, he shall come back with songs of joy, carrying his sheaves of grain. Hazorim b'dima b'rina yitzoru haloch yelech uvachol nosei meshech hazara bo yavo b'rina nosei alumotav. Thank you.